You never expect war to arrive in a white envelope, until the neighbor who's always watching finally finds her reason. The warning slammed into my hand before I could even unlock the front door. Crisp white paper, HOA, logo bleeding red, Patricia Randall's heels hitting the pavement like a judge's gavel. She scanned my yard with that cold satisfaction, hungry for a flaw. 20,000, due in 30 days, she announced, her voice slicing the quiet morning, every word meant to draw blood. My wife stood behind the living room window, one hand pressed to her stomach, the other clutching the curtain for support, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Neighbors peered from behind blinds, faces half hidden, eager to witness someone else's humiliation. Patricia lingered, letting the silence stretch, then let her gaze crawl over our front steps, the battered flower beds, the old family wind chime, the same one my daughter hung before her last hospital stay. The only thing uglier than the dying plants she'd condemned was the pleasure she took in watching us suffer. She pivoted with a triumphant smirk, heels clicking, the envelope in my hand still burning as the street held its breath. I stood there in hesitation, feeling the world tilt just slightly off its axis. The number on the paper wasn't just a fine, it was a threat, a shot across the bow, a warning to anyone who thought about coloring outside her carefully drawn lines. Our drought-tolerant garden was small, but to the council president, it was a declaration of war. Bullies rarely check names. My hands didn't shake as I folded the notice and slipped it into my pocket. Not because I wasn't angry, anger was a fire in my chest, but because I'd seen this kind of power play before. Not in a neighborhood, but in boardrooms and city offices. People like her live for control. They build their little empires on fear, on silence, on the hope that nobody will fight back. They're usually right. But today, she picked the wrong family. This green corner is more than it looks. Every stem has a story, and it's all we have left of my mother. I took a slow breath, letting the sun warm my face, the smell of sage and lavender breaking through the morning haze. My wife opened the door behind me, the hinges creaking. Her eyes searched mine, a silent question hanging in the space between us. Would we cave? Would we dig it all up, pretend none of it mattered, pay the penalty and keep our heads down? Number. Not this time. Maybe you've stood on a porch like mine, paper in hand, heart pounding as someone in power tries to erase your story. Maybe you know what it's like to struggle for something only you can truly understand. Because in every town, there's someone like Patricia Randall, and in every family, there's a line that can't be crossed. They called my garden a violation. They called my wife's quiet courage a nuisance. They never bothered to learn who I am or what I do for a living. I didn't argue, didn't plead. I simply watched the council president strut down the path, her heels clicking like a gavel. She thought she'd won before the battle even started. She has no idea the fight she just picked, and she definitely doesn't know what I'm truly capable of. If you love seeing the underdog flip the script on power-hungry HOAs, smash that subscribe button. Your support turns every fight into a movement. The next morning, Willow Glen Estates pulsed with the quiet dread of a community on edge. The news of our so-called yard violation had already made its way through group chats and morning dog walks. I didn't have to check the neighborhood app to know that Patricia Randall's victory lap had begun. Her favorite stage was the HOA office, an over-air-conditioned room at the back of the community clubhouse, its windows looking out on the spotless playground she'd personally overseen. Most people only came here to sign paperwork or pay dues, never realizing how much power was wielded behind that heavy glass door. I arrived just after 9, the file in my hand, as unread as when she'd handed it over. No one wanted to cross the board president, and her office showed it. She looked up as I entered, lips curving into the kind of smile you give a child who's tracked mud across your clean floor. "Mr. Morales," she said, "here to pay your fine." Her tone made it clear she'd already told herself this story, the stubborn homeowner who'd cave after a single night of worry. I offered her the envelope, watching as she slid it into a drawer without even checking the name. She was already on to the next victim. The enforcer wasn't just enforcing regulations. She was setting an example. Every letter she sent, every penalty she issued, became a warning to others. Don't stand out. Don't question authority. The air in the office was thick with quiet resignation, as if the walls themselves had grown tired of holding so many secrets. Behind her, a corkboard displayed a map of Willow Glen, colored pins marking each violation, gardens, fences, porch swings, even a chalk mural drawn by a neighbor's child. No one was safe. I watched a couple step in behind me, their faces pinched with concern. They clutched a notice like mine, its edges already creased from anxious fingers. The council president never looked up as she spoke to them, her voice soft but absolute. We all have to do our part to maintain standards. That phrase had become her shield. Behind it, she punished those who dared to express anything outside her vision of suburban perfection. As I waited my turn, I scanned the room, noting every detail: the constant hum of the vending machine, the scuff marks on the linoleum, the tired sigh of the secretary, Marcus Reed, shuffling files. He glanced at me, eyes flicking toward the closed door that led to the board's private meeting room. Something passed between us, a moment of silent understanding before he looked away. Patricia finally finished with the couple and called me forward. I leaned in just enough to lower my voice, letting the hum of the vending machine drown out our conversation. "You're building quite a collection there," I said, nodding at the pile of fines. She bristled, not used to being challenged. "Rules are rules, Mr. Morales," she replied. "If you don't like them, perhaps this isn't the right community for you." There it was, the veiled threat, the promise that nonconformity would be punished until you gave in or gave up. But I saw the flicker of annoyance behind her eyes. I wasn't supposed to talk back, wasn't supposed to notice the pattern. The meeting ended quickly. I left the office, feeling the weight of 100 unseen eyes as I walked through the clubhouse lobby. Outside, the air was warmer, the laughter of children playing at the edge of the park drifting over the fence. For them, the world was still bright and safe. For the rest of us, the shadow of the HOA grew longer by the day. I made my way past the playground, tracing the sidewalk back toward home. Along the way, I noticed a row of freshly planted shrubs lining the community pool, a project Patricia had insisted on at the last board meeting, paid for by another round of raised dues. There was irony in the contrast, her plants, flawless and bland, ours, wild but alive with memory. As I rounded the corner, an older neighbor glanced up from her. Our landscape hesitated and then turned away. The message was clear. No one wanted to draw attention. Not now. Not when the enforcer was watching. In that moment, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about one garden, one fine, or even my family's pain. Patricia's pattern of targeting anyone who stepped out of line was a warning to the entire neighborhood. Compliance wasn't safety. It was surrender. I gripped the violation notice in my hand, the paper creasing beneath my fingers. The time for quiet endurance was over. This battle wasn't just for us. It was for every voice that had been silenced, every story erased by a red stamp. The neighborhood park felt different that afternoon. A hush had settled over the swing sets, the laughter of children replaced by nervous conversations drifting from shaded benches. I found myself wandering along the winding path, each step heavy with the memory of Patricia's warning. The sun was starting to slip behind the clubhouse, long shadows stretching across the grass as if the whole place had exhaled in relief to see her leave for the day. At the far end of the park, Marcus Reed sat hunched on a bench, a folder balanced on his knees and his hands knotted tightly in his lap. From a distance, he looked like just another resident savoring a quiet moment. But the tension in his shoulders gave him away. The HOA's secretary wore responsibility like a weight that refused to be shrugged off. His eyes flicked to the aisle, playground, and then to the path, as if measuring the risks of being seen speaking to me. I slowed, giving him the chance to look away. Instead, he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and I took a seat beside him. The hush between us was filled with the distant thud of a basketball and the whir of a nearby lawnmower. I studied him out of the corner of my eye. Marcus was always polite at board meetings, rarely voicing more than a sentence or two before yielding to the enforcer's certainty. But now, away from the glare of her authority, the mask had slipped. He stared straight ahead, lips pressed together, the tendons in his neck taut. His foot tapped an anxious rhythm on the brick pathway. I could see the folder's corners were worn. The papers inside shifted as if handled too many times. The struggle was written in every line of his posture, a man torn between duty and conscience. Marcus finally spoke. I thought the rules were for fairness, but I was wrong. His confession hung in the air, heavy as the humidity before a summer storm. I didn't press him, didn't need to. The guilt was plain in his rigid posture, in the way his shoulders curled inward, making himself small. I recognized the signs. I'd seen them before in city offices, in people who wanted to do the right thing, but were trapped by the consequences of speaking up. The wind picked up, stirring the scent of cut grass and blooming crepe myrtle. I let the silence stretch, letting Marcus decide how much to say. He opened the folder, then closed it again, thumb tracing the edge as if searching for courage. Patricia isn't wrong about everything, he said quietly, but she's gone too far. She's making examples out of people who can't fight back. There it was, the fracture in the foundation. Marcus wanted to believe in the system, but what he'd seen behind closed doors had unsettled him. The board meetings, the private conversations, the lists drawn up in red ink, all of it pointed to something more than mere rule enforcement. It was targeted, calculated, personal. He hesitated, glancing at me for the first time. "You're not like the others, Morales. You don't just let things happen." There was a question in his eyes, but also a plea, a hope that someone might do what he couldn't. I placed a reassuring hand on the bench, grounding myself in the here and now. "Sometimes regulations need to be challenged," I replied. My voice was steady, my resolve sharpening with every word, especially when they are used to keep people silent. Marcus nodded, a slow acceptance working its way through his body. He still looked uneasy, as if the act of speaking had cost him something. But for the first time, I saw the possibility of an ally, however reluctant. As we watched the sun dip below the rooftops, the shadows around us grew deeper, hinting at the battles still to come. Somewhere nearby, a door slammed and the spell was broken. Marcus gathered his things, his posture stiffening once more. Without another word, he rose and disappeared into the quiet streets, the conflict still etched into every step. I watched him go, understanding that his struggle wasn't just his own. In this place, hesitation was safety, but silence was also surrender. And now, someone else knew just how far the enforcer was willing to go to keep her version of order intact. Evening brought a heavy stillness. Lights blinked on, families stayed inside, and laughter faded early. In the softly lit lobby of the clubhouse, I could feel the tension as I passed, a stiffness in the way residents greeted each other, a nervousness that spread like a cold draft every time the entrance door swung open. I stepped inside, shoulders tense from the walk over, the night's cool air lingering on my skin. The weekly HOA bulletin glowed on the electronic console behind the receptionist. New announcements scrolled across the screen, but it was the violations and compliance updates banner in bold that captured everyone's attention. Names and addresses flashed briefly, just enough for the watchful to recognize friends, or, worse, themselves. I waited near the coffee station, taking in the muted hum of low conversations. There was a new wariness in the air, like everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Patricia's presence hovered in the background, even when she wasn't in the room. Her methods were evolving. Instead of direct confrontations, her tactics had shifted to something subtler but more punishing. Public exposure. The fines were larger, the language sharper, the threats more explicit. This was more than a warning. It was a declaration. Most neighbors felt helpless, knowing the council always stuck to their script. My own name appeared on the bulletin, the amount next to it growing. With every day I refused to comply. I felt the prickle of eyes on my back, some sympathetic, others avoiding my gaze altogether. No one wanted to be seen siding with the man the enforcer had decided to make an example of. That was the new reality here. Safety was found in invisibility. I wandered out onto the clubhouse patio, the evening air carrying the faint scent of chlorine from the nearby pool. The night was clear, but the peace was artificial, a thin surface over a community boiling with quiet resentment. As I crossed the walkway, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was the husband from the front desk, worry etched deep into his face. "Did you get one too?" he asked in a low voice, glancing nervously toward the doors. I nodded, showing him the latest notice, the total owed now approaching a sum that could pay for a small car. He shook his head, anger and despair mingling in his voice. "We tried to talk to the board last month. Patricia wouldn't even look at us. She just kept quoting bylaws and threatened to bring in lawyers if we didn't comply." I could hear the frustration in his words, the same helplessness that had crept into so many conversations around the neighborhood. People were scared of losing their homes, their sense of belonging, their pride. It was exactly the climate board president thrived on. She didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized them, turning community standards into a tool for personal power. As I walked the winding path back toward my street, the scale of what we were up against became clear. The list of offenders was growing, and with it, the collective anxiety. Porch lights flickered on as I passed, each one a silent signal. Don't draw attention. Don't get involved. Halfway home, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Marcus approaching, his features shadowed by the streetlights. He hesitated, then fell into step beside me. The silence between us was loaded, each of us measuring the risk of speaking in the open. "She's escalating," he finally murmured. "The board's being pushed to approve bigger fines, more public shaming." His hands were stuffed into his pockets, shoulders drawn up as if against the cold. Some of us want to push back, but no one wants to be first. I understood the fear. It was the same fear I'd seen on every face in that lobby, the same that kept good people silent. But something had changed in me. I was done hiding. I was done pretending this was just about a garden. "Someone has to take a stand," I said, voice steady. Marcus glanced at me, a flash of hope, or maybe relief, crossing his features before he disappeared into the darkness. As I reached my front walk, I paused to take in the sight of the memorial green corner, bathed in the soft light of the porch lamp. The petals shimmered, a reminder of what I was fighting for. Patricia might control the Bulletin Association, the fines, even the board's decisions, but she didn't control the one thing that mattered most: resolve. The next morning, I arrived at my office downtown, the city skyline just starting to shimmer beneath the early sun. For most people, this was just another Thursday. For me, it was the day I would finally use every skill and ounce of resolve that had been quietly building over weeks. As the city inspector's badge clipped to my jacket caught the light, I felt the familiar weight of duty settle on my shoulders. Except now, it was personal. I made my way past cubicles where colleagues chatted over coffee and blueprints, each immersed in their own piece of the city's puzzle. The air smelled faintly of paper and ink, punctuated by the distant ring of a landline. I took my seat in the corner, pulled up the HOA's violation notice, and began my real work. This wasn't the first time a neighborhood group had pushed its power too far, but the board president's campaign was a new kind of ruthless. She'd weaponized technical language, turning bylaws into barricades. What she hadn't counted on was how much I knew about the machinery behind those rules, the layers of city codes, environmental regulations, and federal guidelines that quietly limited even the most ambitious HOA president's reach. I dug into city ordinances, running my fingers along the edges of legal texts I'd helped revise myself. There it was. A clause, newly updated, that protected drought-resistant landscaping as a matter of public policy. Not only that, but the Americans with Disabilities Act created a requirement for accessible walkways and landscaping modifications, something Patricia's blanket aesthetic regulations ignored completely. It was clear her fines didn't just overreach, they stood in direct violation of laws meant to protect families like mine. I let the relief wash over me for a moment. My anxiety faded, replaced by the confidence that I wasn't alone. The system was built for moments like this. I kept my focus, knowing this fight was bigger than our garden. In the quiet privacy of my cubicle, I drafted an internal report. Every detail had to be exact. Dates, violations, photographic evidence, and a legal analysis pointing to where the HOA had overstepped. I attached the relevant city policies, highlighting the very lines that rendered the enforcer's actions unenforceable. My fingers moved quickly, guided by a clarity that had been missing for weeks. As I worked, memories surfaced, my mother kneeling in the soil, teaching me the difference between a weed and a wildflower, my wife's laughter as we picked out the first sage plant, the feeling of belonging that came from shaping a patch of earth into something alive. The enforcer saw only chaos. She couldn't see the roots, the history, the necessity of change. A notification flashed on my screen, a meeting invite from my supervisor. I walked down the hall, report in hand, heart pounding in anticipation. The conference room was filled with sunlight and the familiar scent of whiteboard markers. I presented my findings, outlining the pattern of abuse and the legal errors in the HOA's approach. My supervisor listened intently, nodding as I described the residents' fear and the urgency of the situation. "This isn't just your struggle, Morales," he finally said. "It's bigger than one neighborhood. Let's make sure it's handled right." The words filled me with pride and something deeper. For the first time since this started, I felt momentum building, like the tide turning beneath my feet. We agreed to initiate a formal review and notify the city's legal team. The process would take time, but a chain reaction had started. By the time I returned to my desk, the morning sun had risen high enough to fill my workspace with a clear, unwavering light. I scanned the faces of my coworkers, each one unaware of the shift that had just begun. The battle wasn't won yet, but for the first time, I knew exactly how to fight it, and I knew I had the law on my side. Outside the office window, the city moved as it always had, quiet, relentless, alive, with possibilities. As I packed up for the day, I looked once more at the folder on my desk, feeling the distance between Willow Glen and this high-rise office shrink. Patricia thought she could silence dissent with a penalty. She didn't realize that sometimes all it takes is one person to push back. And that person was ready. Evening shadows spilled across the kitchen tiles as I set my bag on the counter, the room still and heavy with the aftermath of another day. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, almost comforting in the hush that followed the tension of the week. My wife stood at the stove, stirring a pot with absent-minded movements, her eyes distant. Lost somewhere beyond the window, where the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in gold and blue. The garden glowed outside, our landscape, alive with memory, persistence, and the quiet hope that things could change. She didn't need to speak for me to understand her worry. I watched her shoulders rise and fall as she tried to push aside the latest notice from the HOA. The paper now folded neatly beside the fruit bowl. I crossed the room and slipped an arm around her, feeling the gentle swell of her belly beneath my hand. This battle had always been about more than rules, more than plants or fines. It was about legacy, survival, and the kind of life we wanted for the family we'd built with such effort and care. That evening, we stayed quiet. The garden was our only peace. The HOA's latest escalation, the threat of legal action, the public postings, had unsettled the entire neighborhood. I'd seen the effect in the averted gazes of residents, the closed blinds, the whispered conversations. But here, in the quiet of our yard, I felt the tug of resolve tighten inside me. Patricia could shame us, but she couldn't erase what this place meant. Inside, my wife joined me, her silhouette framed by the kitchen light. She leaned against my side, silent for a while. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "We can't back down." "Not now." I nodded, feeling her words settle into the space between us. "I found what we need. The law is on our side this time." Her hand tightened on mine. For the first time in weeks, a glimmer of hope returned to her eyes. We watched the yard together, letting the hush of the evening calm the storm that had raged inside us both. I could see the future we dreamed of, still fragile but possible, rooted in this ground. A car passed on the street, headlights sweeping across the yard before vanishing into the night. I closed my eyes, steadying myself for what was coming next. The city review was underway. There would be pushback, confusion, maybe even more threats from the HOA. But I was done feeling powerless. I thought of the other families, those who'd received the same cold, impersonal notices, whose stories had been erased from the bulletin board. This wasn't just our fight anymore. The outcome would set a precedent, open a path for others to follow. The stakes were personal, but the consequences stretched far beyond our own fence line. Later, as the house grew quiet and the world outside slipped into darkness, I sat at the kitchen table, reviewing my notes. Every detail mattered now. The language of the city ordinances, the records of selective enforcement, the testimonies of neighbors afraid to speak on the record. The case was growing, evidence layered upon evidence. I felt the weight of responsibility, but also a new kind of strength, a sense that, for the first time, we were not alone. I looked at the photo of my mother taped to the refrigerator, her smile as bright as the day she'd planted the first seeds. This was for her, for my wife, for the child we'd soon bring into the world. The garden was more than flowers. It was a promise, one I intended to keep, no matter how fierce the storm. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and possibility. I locked eyes with my wife, feeling the steady beat of hope and defiance growing between us. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The decision was made. We would fight, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who had ever been told to hide, to conform, to forget where they came from. A few nights later, a message arrived on my phone just after sunset, a number I recognized but rarely heard from. Just 3 words. Can you talk? The day had ended with rain, streets slick and shining beneath the street lamps, droplets still clinging to the rose bushes by the porch. My wife gave me a small, reassuring nod, understanding what this meant. Marcus wasn't the kind of neighbor to ask for favors, especially not in the middle of a storm. I pulled on a jacket and stepped outside, feeling the night's damp chill settle across my shoulders. The walk to Marcus's house took only a few minutes, but each step felt heavier than the last. His garage door was half open, light spilling onto the driveway, the faint hum of an old radio drifting out to meet me. I knocked twice, quietly, and waited. Inside, Marcus stood surrounded by storage bins and paint cans, nervously pacing between a battered lawnmower and a shelf lined with dusty holiday decorations. He paused when he saw me, swallowing hard before motioning me in and pulling the door closed behind us. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and cardboard, a stark contrast to the scented candles and quiet order of the boardroom where we usually met. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous energy radiating from every movement. I had to be careful, he whispered, glancing at the windows as if expecting Patricia herself to appear from the shadows. Nobody saw you come in, right? I shook my head, keeping my voice low. What's this about, Marcus? He hesitated, then reached into a battered file box on a back shelf and pulled out a thick envelope, edges frayed from handling. I kept copies, he said, pushing it toward me, of everything. The meeting minutes, the emails, the records of every violation Patricia pushed through, especially the ones that never made it to the official reports. My pulse quickened as I opened the envelope. Inside were printouts and handwritten notes, each one dated and marked with careful precision. This is all of it? He nodded, glancing away. I thought about shredding it all, about just pretending none of it ever happened. But after what I saw, the way she treated your family, the way she talked about other residents, I couldn't just sit by anymore. The admission came with a visible relief, his shoulders slumping as if he'd finally set down a burden he'd been carrying for far too long. I flipped through the documents, piecing together a timeline of targeted fines, board votes without quorum, rules that shifted to suit Patricia's preferences. There were emails where she openly discussed making an example out of certain families, mine among them. Marcus's notes filled in the gaps, underlining patterns I'd only suspected before. We both knew the risks, but Marcus wasn't willing to stay silent anymore. I tucked the envelope under my arm, gratitude and respect warring with the anxiety of what this evidence meant. Thank you, Marcus. This changes everything. He nodded again, more sure of himself now. Whatever happens next, I'll back you up. Just be careful. She has friends on the committee, but not everyone supports her the way she thinks. We stood in hesitation for a moment, the only sound the steady drip of water from the garage roof. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising more storms before morning. Marcus reached for the garage door, pausing as he looked back at me. If you win this, you won't just be fixing your own problem. You'll be setting the neighborhood free. His words lingered as I stepped back into the night. I hurried home through the rain, the envelope pressed close to my chest, heart pounding with hope and uncertainty. At last, the puzzle was coming together, not just in my favor, but for everyone who'd been forced into silence by fear and intimidation. Back inside, I spread the documents across the kitchen table, feeling my wife's hand rest on my shoulder as she read over my arm. For the first time, the fight felt possible, winnable even. The path forward had never been clearer. The risk was real, but so was the promise of something better. Morning arrived shrouded in mist, a veil of gray blurring the edges of the neighborhood, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I sat up at the old desk in my home office, the room still lined with moving boxes and family photographs waiting for a quieter season. My wife moved quietly around me, her presence steady, grounding me in the storm that was about to break. I laid out Marcus's documents, organizing them by date and type. Each sheet added weight to the growing case, a record, of board meetings held without proper notice, emails between committee members plotting selective enforcement, fines that escalated at the enforcer's whim. The story these pages told was bigger than a single family or a patch of wildflowers. It was a history of power abused and trust shattered, and now, for the first time, there was proof. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Heard the enforcers trying to call an emergency board session. She knows you're not backing down. The message sent a pulse of adrenaline through me, sharpening my focus. Patricia's grip on the council was slipping, but that only made her more dangerous. The time for caution had passed. I drafted an email to the city's code enforcement office, attaching the most damning documents, records of penalty issued in clear violation of city policy, transcripts of meetings where votes were rushed or faked, evidence that residents had been punished for changes that were not only legal but encouraged by drought ordinances. I wrote with precision, using the language of the law, every word calculated for maximum impact. My hands moved quickly, propelled by the momentum of purpose. Beside me, my wife sorted through her own notes, compiling stories from other neighbors, people who had been too afraid to speak up but had quietly shared their experiences. Each story added another thread to the tapestry, binding us together. "You're not alone in this," she said quietly, her eyes meeting mine over the sea of paper. "You never were." I placed a call to a colleague in the city planning department, a friend I trusted. I laid out the facts, careful to stay within the bounds of professionalism, but making it clear how urgent the situation had become. On the other end of the line, there was a long hesitation. Then, "This isn't just HOA overreach. This is something the city can't ignore." I'll get the ball rolling from my end. The pieces clicked into place. The evidence, the testimonies, the legal violations. Each element of the plan depended on the next. A delicate sequence that had to hold if we wanted any chance at success. I spent hours cross-referencing city ordinances, marking the pages that would matter most in the official complaint. Every detail had to be airtight. Patricia would fight back with everything she had, and I refused to give her even a single opening. As the afternoon ended, I felt hope for the first time in weeks. Back inside, my wife joined me at the desk, her hand finding mine. "No matter what happens," she said, her voice fierce, "we're stronger together." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in my chest. We were no longer isolated, no longer alone against the storm. With Marcus's courage, my wife's resilience, and the stories of our neighbors woven into the case, the plan was ready. I printed the complaint, every page stamped with the conviction that this wasn't just about my garden, or even my family. It was about drawing a line, saying no to intimidation, no to unchecked power, no to the erasure of what made this place a home. As evening fell, I stacked the finished documents neatly on the edge of the desk. The next step would be the hardest, submitting the case, facing the enforcer and the board, and trusting that the truth would matter more than fear. But tonight, as the last rays of sunlight touched the photo of my mother on the wall, I felt prepared in a way I hadn't before, ready for the confrontation ahead, ready to defend what mattered most. This was no longer just a struggle for survival. It was the start of something bigger, a chance to show everyone in Willow Glen Estates that change was possible. The next day dawned with the energy of anticipation. The air in Willow Glen Estates was electric. Word of a coming confrontation had begun to spread, whispered along hedges and over fences. I arrived at the community center just after lunch, a folder under my arm and a sense of purpose guiding every step. The meeting room, normally reserved for craft nights and birthday parties, had been transformed into a nerve center of quiet rebellion. Residents arrived quietly, hope and fear in their eyes. My wife greeted them. Some had lost gardens, others faced fines, everyone had a story. The stories wove together, filling the space with shared frustration and cautious optimism. I called the meeting to order, outlining the plan with calm determination. My job wasn't just to share the evidence Marcus had risked so much to provide. It was to make each person feel seen, to let them know they weren't alone. I passed around copies of city ordinances, highlighting the sections that protected our right to plant drought-tolerant gardens, that limited the power of HOAs to dictate private landscapes, that forbade the kind of targeted harassment we'd all experienced. As questions came, I answered with the assurance of someone who'd spent years navigating bureaucratic mazes. Every concern was met with a solution. how to document interactions with the association, how to respond to penalty, how to request public records and file complaints. The more we talked, the more resolve took root. People who had been afraid to speak up found their voices, encouraged by the solidarity in the room. Midway through, Marcus shared his story. He spoke in low, careful tones, but the pain was visible in the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. He described how the association's culture had changed, how decisions were made in secret, how good people were pressured into silence or complicity. For the first time, the group saw Patricia's regime not as an unstoppable force, but as a structure that could be challenged, and maybe, just maybe, brought down. I organized everyone into small groups to collect written statements, catalog fines, and pool evidence. My wife circulated with a clipboard, helping neighbors write their accounts in their own words. Each new document made our case stronger. By the end of the afternoon, we had a file thick enough to demand attention from the city and the board. A sense of unity pulsed through the meeting room. Jokes surfaced, laughter breaking through tension, as people remembered what it felt like to hope. Even Marcus seemed lighter, his posture straightening as others thanked him for his courage. There was risk in what we were doing, everyone understood that, but there was also power in numbers, and for the first time, the threat of retaliation seemed smaller than the promise of change. As the meeting wrapped up, I collected the statements, organizing them by date and issue. Marcus helped me sort the evidence, his efficiency masking a nervous excitement. I promised everyone that we'd submit the full complaint to the city first thing the next morning and keep the group informed every step of the way. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Residents lingered, exchanging contact information and promising to check in on one another. The fear that had kept us apart for so long was dissipating, replaced by the sense that we were part of something bigger than ourselves. My wife slipped her hand into mine as we watched the last guests leave, her eyes shining with pride. We were ready for tomorrow. Our voices mattered again. Dawn broke with a restless energy, the clouds over the city tinged with the pale pink of hope and nerves. By 7, I was already dressed and out the door, the folder of evidence tucked securely beneath my arm. The streets were still quiet, a hush lingering over Willow Glen Estates, as if the neighborhood itself was waiting for a verdict. I drove towards City Hall, the car cutting through the morning mist, each traffic light another beat in a slow, steady drum roll. The code enforcement office buzzed with the hum of printers and the soft tap of shoes on polished linoleum. Sunlight poured through the high windows, catching the dust motes and painting patterns across the desks. I checked in at the front counter, my name barely more than a whisper as I signed the visitor log. This was familiar ground, but today the stakes felt infinitely higher. A clerk led me to a small conference room at the end of a carpeted hallway, the walls lined with framed city maps and photos of past mayors. My palms were damp as I opened the file, spreading the documents across the table. I arranged the statements from my neighbors, the ordinance printouts, Marcus's annotated meeting minutes, each piece a thread in a story that, together, could no longer be ignored. Soon my contact from code enforcement arrived, a colleague I'd trusted for years, now the city's chief investigator. She glanced at the evidence, her expression shifting from routine professionalism to a frown of concern as she read the notes. "This isn't just overreach," she murmured, flipping through the emails. "It's targeted. Systemic ice." Explained what Patricia had done, how the board had twisted the rules to suit her personal agenda, how families had been fined, shamed, and driven into hesitation. I described the way public postings had escalated, the whispers that now dominated the playgrounds and park benches. She listened carefully, stopping to ask questions and clarifying points. Each answer tightened the case. As we spoke, I felt my anxiety wane, replaced by a slow-burning resolve. The city had rules meant to protect, not persecute. The words I'd committed to paper over weeks of sleepless nights finally found their audience. "We'll open a formal investigation," my colleague assured me, voice steady with the weight of authority. "I'll personally oversee the process. No one's above the law." Leaving the conference room, I stepped into the hallway, shoulders lighter than there had been in months. The battle wasn't over, but now the fight belonged to more than just one family. The city's legal team would follow up, interviews would be scheduled, records would be reviewed. The enforcer's power was no longer unchecked. Outside, sunlight glinted off the courthouse steps, the city coming alive in a rush of commuters and traffic. My phone buzzed, a message from Marcus. Heard the city's moving fast. Patricia's calling an emergency association meeting for tonight. Another message came in from a neighbor. We're with you. Let us know what you need. I made my way back to Willow Glen, the folder now emptied but my mind racing with possibilities. The house was a flurry of quiet activity. My wife reviewing notes, neighbors texting updates, allies sharing what they'd heard from the board. Word spread quickly that the city had begun its review. Rumors of change rippled through the neighborhood, excitement and anxiety mixing in equal measure. By evening, we learned Patricia would have to face the city. As dust settled, I gathered with my family and residents in our living room, the sense of unity tangible. Marcus arrived with a few of the quieter residents, those who'd been most afraid, and for the first time, I saw hope instead of defeat in their eyes. I looked at the garden outside, the memorial stone glowing softly beneath the porch light, the flowers and grasses standing tall in the gathering darkness. Every struggle, every sleepless night had led to this. We had done everything possible to bring the truth to light. Now, it was time for those in power to answer. The clock ticked closer to the association meeting. We filed out together, stepping into the crisp evening air, hearts pounding with the knowledge that this was more than a neighborhood dispute. It was a test of fairness, of who truly belonged and whose voices mattered. Whatever the outcome, none of us would ever be invisible again. The clubhouse pulsed with an energy I'd never felt in Willow Glen Estates. Rows of chairs stretched from the wide glass doors to the makeshift dais at the front, every seat claimed and dozens more standing against the walls. Voices mingled in the air, some anxious, others quietly defiant. At the back, city officials conferred in low voices, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning the crowd with practiced focus. Patricia sat at the head of the board's table, flanked by her loyalists, the usual mask of composure a little too still tonight. The faces of her supporters were tight, uncertain. Rumors had swirled all afternoon. City inspectors were coming. The council president would be called to answer for her methods. Nothing would be swept under the rug this time. My wife stood near the entrance, offering calm encouragement to the neighbors as they filtered in. Marcus was there, posture rigid but determined, a quiet beacon for the few board members who still harbored doubts. Every few minutes, a new resident entered, clutching documents or just the hope that things could change. The murmur of the crowd grew with each arrival. When the city's chief investigator finally approached the front, the room fell silent. She began with a brief explanation of city policy, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too many small tyrannies go unchecked. This association has been the subject of multiple complaints, she announced, scanning the room with clear eyes. Tonight, we will address each issue. If you have testimony or documentation, you'll be heard. The enforcer opened the meeting with the same confidence she'd used to silence opposition before, her voice measured, her arguments rehearsed. She cited regulations, quoted bylaws, painted herself as a defender of order. But the mood in the room had shifted. The deference she was used to had vanished. When she dismissed the complaints as misunderstandings, a ripple of unrest ran through the crowd. One by one, residents stepped forward, some with trembling hands, others emboldened by the presence of the city's officials. Each recounted their story: gardens torn out, penalty that arrived without warning, rules that seemed to shift overnight. I watched as the city investigator's expression grew more grave, the case for intervention building with every account. My turn came. I laid out the evidence Marcus had risked so much to collect: meeting records, emails, printouts of every violation Patricia had authorized. I explained the city's own ordinances, pointing to the places where her enforcement clashed with public policy and basic rights. The board's attorney tried to interrupt, but the investigator cut him off. "We'll hear everyone tonight," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The atmosphere in the room changed again, no longer just tense but electric, charged with possibility. Even the enforcer's supporters shifted uneasily in their seats as the facts piled up. Marcus stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly, and shared what he'd witnessed behind closed doors. His voice was stronger than I'd ever heard it, steady, honest, impossible to dismiss. Applause broke out after several residents finished, a wave of support moving through the hall. Tears ran down the face of an older woman as she described how her late husband's memorial tree had been threatened with removal. Others spoke of the fear they had felt each time a new notice appeared, the humiliation of being singled out in the name of community standards. The city investigator listened to it all, taking notes and asking questions. When the testimony ended, she addressed the association directly. Based on what we've heard and reviewed tonight, immediate corrective action is required. Further legal review will determine whether additional penalties are warranted. The enforcer's face betrayed little, but her grip on the gavel was white-knuckled, her voice thin as she called for the meeting's adjournment. There was no more applause, just a long exhale from the crowd, the sound of a community finally allowed to speak. For the first time, Willow Glen felt hopeful. Dawn arrived quietly, its golden light slipping over the rooftops and painting the dew-kissed petals of our green corner in a palette of soft hope. For the first time in months, I walked the front path without the heaviness of dread clinging to my every step. My wife joined me beneath the old maple, her hand entwined with mine, our hesitation comfortable and full of things understood without words. The aftermath of the board meeting swept through Willow Glen Estates like a cleansing breeze. News traveled fast. Patricia's reign was over. The city's official report landed on every doorstep that morning, a clear and final decree. All fines issued in violation of city policy were null and void. Residents whose gardens had been threatened received apologies and, in some cases, restitution for damages. Most importantly, the HOA was ordered to revise its bylaws, aligning them with both local ordinances and the rights of every homeowner. Marcus resigned from the association, his letter both a relief and a rallying cry. In the days that followed, new leaders emerged. People who had once shrunk from the spotlight now stood at the forefront, determined to rebuild trust and restore balance. The community, so long divided by fear, found new reasons to gather. Neighbors organized garden tours, potlucks returned to the park, and laughter echoed through streets once thick with suspicion. Our yard, once marked for destruction, became a symbol of resilience. Residents brought cuttings from their own yards, adding splashes of color and variety to the space that had started as a memorial for my mother. The memorial stone, warmed by the morning sun, seemed to anchor us all, a reminder of what we'd fought for and what we'd reclaimed. Standing at the edge of the lawn, I wondered if the fight had been worth it. But as I looked at my wife, at the life growing inside her, at the neighbors waving, from porches and driveways, I knew the answer. It had always been about more than regulations or aesthetics. It was about the stories we root in the land we call home, the memories that bloom and fade and return, shaping the spaces we live in and the people we become. The board president's rules had tried to erase those stories, but in the end, it was her power that faded, swept away by the collective will of people who refused to be silenced. We had set a new standard for every neighbor who felt alone. Later that afternoon, we gathered in the garden for a small celebration. Marcus arrived with his family, a little hesitant at first, but soon drawn into conversation by those eager to thank him for his courage. There were hugs, laughter, and the soft murmur of relief. Someone brought a homemade pie, another strummed a guitar, and the air was thick with a sense of possibility. A community, whole again. As the sun dipped low, I found a quiet moment to kneel by the memorial stone, pressing my palm to the smooth surface. "We did it," I whispered, not just to my mother's memory, but to every person who had once felt powerless and now stood a little taller. Looking up, I saw my wife standing near the front steps, one hand resting protectively over her belly, her smile luminous in the fading light. The future stretched ahead, open and unwritten, but grounded in something real: honor, resilience, and the belief that even the smallest voice can tip the balance. Got your own HOA showdown? Subscribe now and share your victory story in the comments. Night fell gently over Willow Glen Estates. Porch lights glimmered, and the garden, once threatened by a red-stamped notice, bloomed brighter than ever. Peace, hard won, deeply felt, settled in, promising that what we'd built together would last.